Awesome. Let's kick it off. First and foremost, welcome guys, and thank you all so much for tuning in to Textbook Ventures Live AMA. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, Textbook Ventures is essentially an organization run by students for students in the startup and tech space across New South Wales. My name is David, and I'll be your moderator for this session on startups. And specifically for this session, we'll be talking about launching your career in startups. I think this is a perfect segment for students that are on the fence about venturing into the startup space, whether that's joining a startup or even building one for yourself down the line. Joining me tonight, we have a very special guest and speaker, Juri Han, who you guys see just in. But just before we dive in, there's a few housekeeping items that I'd like to run through. A, if you're joining in, please make sure your mic is muted and that your video is turned off. And B, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask throughout the chat, drop in the comment section below, and then we'll go over it towards the end. Just for the format of this chat, we'll spend around the first 35 to 40 minutes covering a few questions that we had prepared, and then we'll leave around 20 minutes towards the end for any audience Q&As. So with that said, I'm excited to kick up the session and welcome Juri. Juri, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us tonight.
Hello, and thank you for everybody, especially those in UNSW who are still doing their mid-sems, for joining tonight.
Awesome. I guess first things first, for those of us that may not be familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story so far and what got you here today?
Sure. So hi everyone. Like David mentioned, my name is Juri Han. I am an Australian-born Korean, and so I've lived here all of my life. In terms of career, I have about 10 years of, so I'd say a decade of experience in the startup as well as corporate space. And so I'll just do a quick run through from 10 years ago to now. 10 years ago, I started off in strategy and sales ops at IBM. And I actually spent more years than I expected at IBM. Sorry, David, there's a bit of an echo.
There's a bit of an echo? Just give me a sec. How's that?
Let's see how we go. Where was I at? So I was at IBM for the first couple of years of my career. Perfect, got a thumbs up. And the majority of my time at IBM, after starting off in strategy and ops, I actually moved into sales, enterprise sales. And that's where the majority of my career has really taken place. Off the back of, a couple of years in enterprise sales at IBM, I moved to Google in what was the quote unquote startup within a startup, though it's a much bigger corporate organization now, and spent about 3 years there, creating and scaling up the sales development arm of Google Cloud. It's now called Google Cloud. It actually went through 3 brand changes whilst I was there. We can go into that a little bit more if that's of interest. Off the back of Google, I then moved to the UK and I headed up strategic partnerships for a very early stage startup called Brolly. They were insur-tech mobile app. I was there for about a year. Couple of really interesting ventures. Everything from very, very humbling sort of inbound sort of partnerships inquiries all the way to 2 potential M&A conversations that I led. Off the back of that, moved back to Australia. And in the last year and a half, I've been at Uber, heading up the sales team called Uber for Business, based out of Sydney. And, as we mentioned, with COVID, I've actually recently been made redundant and I've left the business less than a fortnight ago. And so here we are looking for my next gig, and I'm unsure as to what that'll look like, but that's my journey so far.
Yeah, amazing. There's a lot of ups and downs, especially recently. But I just wanted to understand a little bit about your career decisions thus far. I'm sure you've moved across a few different big tech companies and also into early stage companies. I want to understand what kind of factors were at play that made you want to transition from one role to the next. And more recently, what are you looking to do in the next few months or few years?
Yeah, this is the mother of all questions, isn't it? And the reality is there is no perfect answer. You never really know what an organization or what a role is going to look like after you've actually, until after you've taken the plunge. There's just genuinely no way of analyzing that and getting to, you know, a clear conclusion beforehand. But I did, you know, I've sort of written some prompts and written some notes in terms of, you know, some of the factors and the variables that I considered every time I made a career decision. I'm going to start with sort of 5 key things that were very helpful for me when I was trying to decide. The first is to give yourself options. So I'll be very honest, when I started at IBM, the reason why I chose it was because I had very few options. I didn't actually go into this, you know, in my introduction, but I'd come back from an exchange in Milan. I won't go into the details, but I missed many of the graduate application deadlines. And as a result, honestly, IBM was the only option that I had. And so I was like, all right, let's take it. In terms of the startup ecosystem in Sydney at the time, it was very nascent, very, very nascent. And so it wasn't even an option that I considered really, you know, in terms of jobs or companies. So first and foremost, give yourself options. Try and give yourself more than one. If you only have one, then there you go. But you do create a lot of leverage the more that you have. The next thing I thought was to find your strengths. So for example, at IBM, actually prior to IBM, when I was at uni and growing up in high school, I realized that I had a real knack for analysis. I'm very naturally data driven. And I remember, you know, again, at UNSW, I did commerce and international studies. And in my commerce major, I didn't mind quant. And so I thought, okay, here we go. This is my strength. Let's see if I can make a career out of that. Early on, I realized even if I was okay at that level of analysis, it's not something that I wanted to do for the rest of my life as my only thing, sitting behind an Excel spreadsheet, writing a whole ton of macros. And I realized the other aspect of my personality that I really thrived in was talking to people, being a people person, trying to understand why businesses made the decisions that they did. And as a result of sort of finding and doubling down on that strength, I moved into enterprise sales, which I thought would help me much more in terms of presentation, in terms of negotiation, in terms of understanding what other businesses, how the economics of other businesses worked, and what the economic model of a big organization like IBM looked like from that perspective. And I did actually try a number of different types of sales positions. So I started off as an account manager at a very large strategic outsource account from IBM, sort of the strategic partnership side, the sales development side, the head of sales side. Once you find a strength and you go down that path, there are lots of different ways in which you can continue to cultivate and you know, add skill sets to that strength. So that first, give yourself options. Second, find your strengths. Third, I would say focus. Very honestly, whilst I was at IBM, I think I applied to Google about 11 times over about a year and a half, and got rejected 10 of those times and got my first interview on the 11th time. And so I'm not saying only, you know, go after the one company and, you know, only go after sort of applying for that job in a particular way. Be open-minded, experiment, see if you can try different ways of getting into a particular company or a particular business unit. But that focus really did help me to take one step to another. And I think the last 2 things that I wanted to mention is being adaptable. So, you know, how did you make your career decisions? the reality is there are a lot of things that you don't know. Even now, after 10 years of working in the workforce, there are many things that I don't know. And so just being more open-minded to what you could go into, or what you could learn, or how you could, double down on, a potential strength, that can open up a lot of opportunity. If you just focus on trying something new, focusing on learning and getting out of your comfort zone, that actually can take you quite far, just that attitude already. And I think the last thing is, especially as a woman, as a leader, a female leader, you have to back yourself. And don't get me wrong, in every single role that I've done, even now, I have my own insecurities, I have my own doubts. I question many of my business decisions, even as I've been managing a team, even as I've been leading these, very complex M&A negotiations. But the reality is, if you do not back yourself, if you don't go for the role, if you don't bring all of your strengths to the forefront and try and convince the other person to take you on, if you don't do that, no one else is going to do it for you. And so I've gone through quite a lot there, but give yourself options, find your strengths, focus, be adaptable, and back yourself. Those are the 5 things that I would consider in transitioning from one role to the next.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Those are great pointers. I think this is a perfect segue into, I guess, the second part of our questions, which is more about opening up into the space for students. So understanding more about what startup roles are available for students, but also what kind of teams someone might find themselves into after graduating from uni. Juri, could you give us a high-level overview of some of the more common roles that you might find in a startup, and perhaps some of the teams that you've also worked across, and what kind of experience it's like intermingling between those teams?
Sure. So first of all, I would say that there are many different types of startups. And so in terms of getting a breakdown of the different business units within a startup, it depends on how big the startup is. So let's start from there. You can have a really early stage startup. You have series A, B, C, D, all the way through to like really long down the alphabet. And at different parts or different growth stages of a startup, the types, the scale, the business, the types, the size of various business units dramatically changes. Now, I'm going to say this very generally at a very, very high level, but I would say the earlier on, the earlier a company is in terms of its life cycle, the higher, maybe this will be a controversial statement, but this is my opinion, the higher the focus will be on engineering and product, trying to find that product market fit. And so in terms of the main functions and roles within a very, very early stage company, much of it will be revolved around engineering and product. Now, some may say that's the case throughout the entire life cycle of a startup. But what I've also seen is as you get to sort of that mid stage, you've gotten series A, B, C, potential D, E, F funding, mid, that's a lot of it, isn't it? But maybe series A, B, at that time, you really start to see a focus on marketing, a lot of like growth hacking, a lot of a huge focus on customer acquisition. Again, I'm not saying that, anything prior to that or anything later than that is not focused on growth. No, but that marketing side of the business really does grow as a business unit for that size of company. And then as you get sort of further on in terms of the DEF series startups, when they are really trying to scale up the company, and particularly for a company that has a very focused B2B strategy, that's when you start seeing the plethora of sales. And again, it depends on the startup strategy. Some startups never want to venture into B2B enterprise sales. They always want to focus on a different strategy in terms of user acquisition. But at a high level, I would say it depends on where the startup is in terms of their growth phase. And the other thing that I would mention is that there is no one flavor to a startup. So I'll give you a very clear examples from my experience. Uber was a really ops heavy startup. It was all about the hustle. It was all about the grind. If you consider back to what Uber needed to create as a foundation in order for it to be successful as a business, it really needed to acquire people, drivers and riders at every single capital city around the world. And that required, yes, marketing, yes, engineering in terms of the platform, but operations was a really significant element of their growth strategy. Google, where I was at, started off as, Sergey and, I've forgotten his name all of a sudden. But the Google founders. Larry and Sergey. I actually met Larry when I was at Google in my Noogler orientation. But Larry and Sergey, they are engineers through and through. And Google has always been a really engineering focused company. And that, when it was a startup to now, it's never really changed. That was the flavor of the startup. If you think of HubSpot, for example, HubSpot is a really marketing driven startup. It's all about CRM. It's all about content marketing. And so, it's not really, you can't give a one size fits all in terms of the main functions and how big the functions are, how big the roles are of a particular startup. It depends on the culture and the fabric and the flavor of that startup.
For sure, fair point. Just for an example, how do you think someone that's studying, say, for example, finance and accounting might find themselves at a startup place? Because obviously in startups, more traditional roles like operations or sales might not come from like a finance background. And so how do these students kind of like find themselves fitting in to that kind of environment? Or what kind of skills would they need to be upskilling for?
Great question. Very relevant question, because I also have a commerce background and here I am in sales. And at various elements, various times of my career, sometimes I think back to what I studied at uni and genuinely question. I'd have, wine with friends being like, how the hell did we get here? The reality is, whether you're at a startup or whether you're at a corporate, but particularly at a startup, you just need to be flexible. It's like the number one thing, the number one attitudinal characteristic that I look for as a hiring manager. Because the reality is everything that you're learning at university, what is university really good for? Again, maybe controversial opinion. I know everyone is doing midterms and exams at the moment. But honestly, what does university teach you? It teaches you to focus and study, finish deadlines, analyze things and come to interesting insights against a time frame. And it teaches you to start what you finish. Everyone that has a degree has gone through loads and loads and loads of midterms, loads and loads of exams. There are many projects that you had to start and complete in order to get your degree. Now, that is a very, if you abstract it multiple levels, it's a soft skill, right? To be productive, to, organize your time, to focus and get the thing that needs to get done by a particular time. All of these things translate into work, whether it's a startup or a corporate. If you are flexible, if you are humble, and you are very committed to, be willing to learn what needs to be done, hiring managers will love you. Now, particularly because you mentioned commerce, something that I did want to mention is, what's a skill set that is in demand and is easily not replicable, but is like it's a natural path, from my opinion, from sort of the quantitative aspects of commerce, I think is learning SQL. Now, like I said, in terms of startups, a lot of their headcount goes into hiring engineers. And there's, a way, again, controversial opinion, one of the more junior languages, I would say, some programmers would say SQL is not a language, but I do see there being some strong parallels between the data analysis that you did in some of your commerce majors to SQL. SQL is a really high, variable that people that are looking for ops roles look for. And so, you know, it's very similar to an Excel macro. If you can upskill on that and sort of put that on your resume and share with a hiring manager that that's something that you can do, that is also a way in. But ultimately, it's about the attitude. If you're just willing to get into the mud, you know, do what needs to be done in order to get to a goal, a business goal, a startup goal, that gets you into operations.
Great. And I guess just to add on to that, I guess there's also one other big question that a lot of students have in mind. Certainly for a lot of students, I think there's a conception that there's a lot of risk built in inherently in startups. Just want to see what's your take on this costs versus benefits of working in a startup and how this kind of played out in your life so far.
Yeah, I'll be honest, when I first read that, I thought, really? And then I had to sort of think through the question. I was like, yeah, I guess I can see where you're coming from. Now, maybe I will just preface this by saying that I am much more riskier in terms of my risk profile than, say, my partner is very, very risk averse. And I guess that you can also sort of imply that based on my response to that question when I first read it. But my first response would be, it depends on what risk you're trying to avoid. Because if you go into a large company, what are the pros? The pros are that you would generally have a really clear career structure. There will have been lots of business units created for you. If you're a grad, there are like grad programs that exist, programs, you know, which imply structure, which imply rotation, which imply a lot of organizational, knowledge and operational sort of know-how to have, you know, executed something like that before, and that you'll be sort of fitting right into to sort of structure the next couple of years, months of your particular program. What else? But there are other risks in joining a corporate. You might join a really specific, really small, narrow team that, is solving a problem that is only really relevant to a really, really big organization. That's a risk. Another risk that I would say for a lot of members who have started in corporates and sort of never left is you get really used to the perks. If you have your health insurance paid for by your company, you have a particular monthly paycheck that you get used to. In general, these much larger organizations have really distinct sort of pay curves that they follow year to year. And once you start getting used to that, it's really interesting how how comfortable humans can become. And so that I would also say is inherently a risk if you were to go to corporates. Just before I sort of wrap up, I would also sort of share some of the risks of going into a startup. There are risks. The biggest risk is that the startup will run out of money, or the startup will be unable to find product market fit in time, and perhaps render your business unit sort of less important, and you may lose your job. Those are huge risks. That's a big risk. But what I've also found in my career is if you join a startup or an organizational unit that is growing really quickly, it also helps accelerate your career really quickly. I'm young. I'm in my early 30s. I've had a regional leadership role due to my time at Google. And that would not have happened if Google was the size that it is today. It would not have happened if it wasn't for sort of the growth opportunity that lay in that sort of startup environment. And you can benefit a lot in terms of your career if you sort of get in at the right time and you show your skills, you show your value, and you grow with that company and organization.
Perfect. And just one last follow-up to that. Just want to know, if you're choosing to step into a startup, what kind of decision-making criteria would you make in terms of choosing between one startup versus the other? What would you look at? What kind of factors would play into it?
So I have two sort of ways of responding to this. One is my personal sort of considerations, my sort of, as I was thinking through this question, I thought, okay, in my career, how did I make these decisions? Because there were many times when I had to choose between one or two or three options. And the types of considerations that I had, included these. One, team culture. Now, team culture is really important, in my opinion, and most people would agree. I don't think that is a controversial point. And I'll say this: team culture is not better, absolutely, in a startup or a corporate. It's specific to that team. It's specific to that business unit. It's specific to that startup. It's specific to that company. I would not say blanket, joining a corporate will give you better team culture, or joining a startup will give you better team culture. And so really understanding who you'll be working with, what the culture of that team actually looks like, how they make decisions, that's really important to try and understand when you're comparing between two. Particularly in startups, though this is true for larger organizations, I think there's a much bigger influence in this. And so the another big element is really understanding the values of your CEO and founder. What are the values of the founders? And generally at an early stage company, if the founder is the CEO, what are the values that the CEO will be driving in that organization? And this is a really interesting question to try and understand during your interview process. When a company is growing, the company really adopts the values of the founders and the CEO. So if you have conflicting values, that is something that you really want to be attentive to in the interview process before you start. Now, if you do start and you recognize that, that's fine. That's a learning, and it's in your best interest to make the decision, post. But trying to understand the values of your founder, which will then become the values of your of that startup, and comparing them and seeing what aligns more closely to you, that is really important. Another aspect, particularly in startups, that I think is useful is understanding how many times they have changed their North Star metric, which is maybe that's something that's a commonly used term, but when I was at uni, I had never heard of it. But it's this idea of your North Star is like the star that sailors use to navigate themselves. It is your number one highest level goal. Now, if an organization or a startup has, again, it depends on sort of where the company's at, and sometimes these very significant pivots are important. But if an organization or a startup has pivoted, say, once every week in the last 6 months, that's a really difficult place to actually get shit done. And so in, speaking really directly, that's really important as well. You want to know that you're going to be joining an organization that you can add value to, and you can't add value to an organization if they keep changing their North Star. So, team culture, values of the founder, understanding how the CEO and the co-founders operate, understanding how decisions get made in that team, and understanding how often the North Star has stayed the North Star and how much they've pivoted. Look, if they've pivoted every other month for the last 12 months, but for the last 6 months, they've stuck to one, that's also a really awesome potential opportunity. So those are some considerations. And sort of the second part to this question I was thinking of is, I heard of this prompt recently, which is out of these 5 different variables: creativity, colleagues, money, status, and social impact. Everyone prioritizes these 5 things in different ways. I'm going to repeat it: creativity, colleagues, money, status, social impact. Judging against your 2 options, your 2 startups, against your sort of value alignment against those 5 variables, and seeing which aligns better, which startup opportunity aligns better to those values, may also be really helpful.
Perfect. Let's also talk about your journey as a founder as well. I think you're also the founder of the Han Kimchi, if I'm correct. Could you give us an overview of the project that you've been working on and what kind of made you take this leap in the first place?
Sure. Now, I have to be honest, I've actually closed down the Han Kimchi a number of years ago now. So it was alive for about a year. They were, in short, intimate kimchi making classes. So they were cooking classes. Thanks, Audrey. What it was, that's what it was. Why did I take this leap? I have known for a really long time that I've wanted something of my own to create, to found, and that just happened to be my first one. Separate to this, I have also started blogging recently, and I also have this small sort of cartoonish Instagram account. So in terms of, you know, things that I do, things that I try and do on the side is, you know, I'm always trying to experiment, but I do genuinely believe that everyone, you know, has a startup that they can found, and everyone is a really creative being, and should express themselves in many different ways, just through the course of life. But yes, the Han Kimchi was alive for about a year. It was an intimate kimchi making class, and I learned a lot from that experience.
Yeah, so just on top of that, what were some of your biggest wins and challenges that you faced in starting that?
So my biggest win, which, you know, may not be a win to sound like a win to all, but it was definitely a win to me, was at the time of closing it, we were at the break-even point. So it was net neutral, which effectively meant I didn't profit off the enterprise, but there were a lot of expenses, and I also didn't sort of make a significant loss off the enterprise. In terms of running the classes, I maximized 100% attendance in all the classes that were done. That was a huge win for me. That is how I got to that break-even point at the end of the year. And I learned so much. I really cannot emphasize this enough. I have no regrets about going through the journey and having done the startup, because I learned so much about the economics of a startup. It was, maybe this also sort of this will segue into the biggest challenges. It was really humbling. It was really humbling to build a business and own the entire funnel, and, you know, encounter so many bloody obstacles along the way and somehow dig yourself out of it. So I might just like pivot into sort of what some of the biggest challenges were. Maybe I'll start off with this quote. I spoke with a girlfriend of mine who owns a florist. She owns a floristry, like a flower, engagement business for weddings and etc. And she made a comment about how it's so easy to have an idea. Everyone has an idea for a startup, you know, and people become very entitled to think that just because they've had an idea that they should own it. But the reality is, having an idea is the easiest part of the startup journey. And executing it is the most difficult element. And in terms of the biggest challenges, man, I was a month out. I had 0 paying customers. It was so humbling. I had to try and figure out how to fill these classes. It was so humbling to try, you know, again, I had done various little bits of digital marketing in my previous roles and had done courses, but trying to actually drive attendance, drive for profit, drive for like paying customers, you know, before a deadline was really, really hard. I had to try a couple of different ways in order to get it done by the day dot. I implored to a lot of my personal network on Facebook to try and sort of fill some of the seats. That was a real pivot. And that's not pretty. It's embarrassing. I found it really embarrassing, but it also taught me a lot in terms of what strategy you need to take, and really planning for what happens when things don't go to plan and you are still in the hole for a lot of different business expenses. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. It's I would highly recommend it to everyone. It's something that is really accessible, especially in this sort of modern world, where a lot of businesses are online. You can start off digital, but just owning something, creating something, and trying to make money off an enterprise that you've built is the fastest way to really learn about the different aspects of a business.
I'm assuming you also working full time when you were running this. I just want to know how you carved out the time to manage to be able to balance a full-time job whilst also starting this project on the side.
So I do have to clarify, the inception of that was when I was unemployed. It was after I'd quit Google and before I'd moved to the UK. But there were other elements during that time when I was still actively working on it and working the startup role in the UK. The reality is, it's all about time management. It's all about your priorities. It's all about, everyone has X amount of time in a day. And instead of maybe going and watching Netflix or finishing an entire sort of Netflix series in a night, which, I'll be the first to admit, I've done that a couple of times through my life. Instead of doing that, actually working on your business, like that's the time. There were also many times when I had to really be strict in terms of my social engagements. You can't do everything. That's the reality. If you are going out every night, having a good time with your friends and family, you'll have no time to actually build something on the side. And so carving out time for your business, carving out time for your side projects ahead of the week, and then sticking to it, being accountable and trying to actually really keep accountable to the goals that you've created for yourself for that week, for that fortnight, for that month. That's all that you can really do. And the thing is, you do have the time. It's just a matter of prioritization.
Perfect. I think this we'll probably open this up to audience Q&As now. We've got a question from Sorad. It says, hi, Juri, you mentioned that flexibility is one of the key things that you look for as a hiring manager. What are some of the characteristics that you look for?
So this is an interesting question. And I will say this from my personal experience. I am not every single hiring manager in the world. So take this with a grain of salt from my perspective. But one of the number one things I look for in a hire, or maybe the word is, this is a red flag. So one of the biggest red flag that I look for, and if I find this, I don't make the call to hire, is arrogance. Arrogance is a killer. There was a really famous, I think, who was it? I think it was Patrick Piketty. He was the CFO at Google when I was at Google. He wrote a really famous internal, at the time it was like Google Plus. I think it's deprecated now, but at the time he made this really famous internal blog post called like, don't hire assholes. Even if someone is brilliant, even if they are really effective, really productive, HDs and everything, if they're an asshole, if they're a pain to work with, if they're a know-it-all, if they don't give you the time of day, they don't pay respect to every single member of the team, there's no way I would taint, my team's culture with someone like that. So first and foremost, don't be an asshole. And, a really good way, if you sort of turn that on its head in terms of what do you look for? You look for someone who gives you, maybe again, this is sort of a more a technical way of responding to questions, but you want someone who can answer in sort of that STAR way, specific, task, action, result. You want someone to be succinct and be able to respond to the question that they're asked. And you also want to see a mix of humility, adaptability, and resilience. One of my favorite authors, Yuval Harari, he wrote *Sapiens*, great book. I'm a big reader, great book that I'd highly recommend. He said that in 20 years, the two biggest characteristics that are going to separate sort of the wheat from the chaff is adaptability and resilience. The types of roles that will exist, that will be at the tops of companies in 20 years' time, is likely not to be in existence at the moment. And so you really need to try and develop adaptability, when shit hits the fan, and you're not really sure how to respond to it, but you hustle and you get it done. Adaptability and resilience, when things get really, really tough and you don't give up and you do what you can in order to get the result. And humility. You cannot problem solve with a team if you think you have all the answers. And so having sort of a grain of humility in you got to back yourself, yes, but you also need to have some humility to work with others. Those are really important characteristics that I look for. But yes, that technical aspect of just answering the question is also quite important.
Got a second question from Victor. Victor asks, what was the move to UK like? And for anyone who's interested in doing something similar to UK or US, what tips would you give them?
Sorry, what was the moods, was it?
I think you were moving to UK for a startup job.
Yes.
And so Victor wanted to ask what it was like, I think, moving out of your home country. I think that's what he was getting at.
Got it. So, I mean, this is a bad time to ask that question because we're in the middle of a pandemic still. It looks like everywhere still. I don't know what travel is going to look like for the next sort of 12 to 24 months until a vaccine is found. But, in short, it was hard. It was a lot harder than I expected. Now, even if I did not go over with a job. And so that was really, really difficult. But even if you do go over with a job, it's a really big thing to have to find an entire community again from scratch, do well at work whilst trying to figure out utilities in a completely foreign country, taxes in a completely foreign country, just trying to get electricity, internet, water, everything sorted, trying to figure out how you're going to commute back and forth, and also, miss everybody back at home. It's, the aspects of my life that I would obviously put on social media were the brightest and shiniest parts, but there were a lot of really, really dirty, difficult nights where I wasn't sure, how it was going to go and, how I was going to make it through. But it was one of the best decisions that I made. I would highly recommend it to everyone. Talking about the adaptability and the resilience that I referred to, that are really important characteristics to develop in your career. Moving to a different country shows a lot of that. And so I really am a big believer in, doing what you can to maximize growth and moving to a different country and figuring it out. That is a really big character building exercise.
Great. We got one question from Perfida. She says, great talk thus far. Thank you. Are passion and work ethic enough for an individual to start a startup? Or do you think there are other ideal qualities one should have or work on? Interesting.
Are passion and work ethic enough to start a startup? That's an interesting question. My first comment is this. For many, many years, have you heard of YC, a Y Combinator?
Yes.
Yes.
Out of the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they are considered to be the startup accelerator to have defined the model of startup accelerators. For many, many years, I think for their first decade of just working, they did not accept startups with only one founder. Why is this? It's a really interesting, I think now, I think in the last couple of years, I've read that they've changed and they do accept startups with one founder. Now, why is that the case? All the stats showed that those companies that had at least 2 founders, and I think the stats dropped dramatically once it got to 3, 4, 5, 6. Too many founders is too many cooks in the kitchen, but 2 would dramatically improve the probability that the startup would get to product market fit. Why is this? It's hard. It's hard to stay accountable with your goals. Now, if you have one other partner to sort of brainstorm with, work with, and get something started with, the potential for that startup to actually go somewhere is greatly improved. In saying that, the Han Kimchi I started by myself. There are many, sort of lifestyle businesses, startups that also start with, one person driving quite a lot of it, and then maybe bringing someone on board at the right time to ensure that it continues growing at the pace that you want. It's, can you do it? Yes. Can you improve your probability of it being really successful if you bring in another person? It also shows that if there is enough, if you really understand your why, maybe a different way to, sort of comment too in terms of response to that question is passion and work ethic enough. What's the biggest thing that I think you need in order for a startup to be successful is being really clear about the problem you're trying to solve for. If you're really passionate about climate change, for example, but you're not super specific about how you and this startup and this business is going to solve for a particular problem in climate change, and how you, this startup, this business is, has a particular advantage to be able to beat everyone else who is trying to go for the same thing, without that, you're dead. Without that clarity and that precision, you're also dead. Now, again, like I said, startups do pivot, you do change. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out that why, but trying to understand and be really clear about that mission and that why, that is also something that you really need in addition to the 2 variables you mentioned.
Awesome. There's a question from Audrey. As a founder, what did your first few days look like from idea to the launch of your business? What would you do differently now if you were launching something in today's climate?
Yeah, great question. And again, this is only my perspective. I'm sure many startup founders do this in many different ways. Something that I have only recently discovered, I'm currently going through a fitness journey. I started this fitness journey at the beginning of the year, with a really clear why, really clear, succinct why. And then I also crafted a really clear sort of vision statement for myself. Sounds a little airy-fairy, doesn't it? I remember in my when I started the Han Kimchi, I did not do this. When I would get into brainstorming discussions in various business units in my previous roles, I always found this to be just, maybe something this is just something that people do, but I didn't really see the impact of it. But for me this year, I have been the most successful, more successful than I've ever been, that compared to my last 3 decades of life in terms of a health journey, because I had a really clear why and a really clear mission statement. Like I said, I'm currently, actually, maybe I haven't said, but I'm actually trying to sort of develop another sort of side project. It'll be much more around productivity tools and sort of intimacy prompts. And I have had this idea for a while, but what am I currently doing? I'm trying to really be clear on my why. Being clear on my why, and then being clear on my goals and my non-goals. Like goal, I mean, for example, I want to lose 5 kilograms by end of year, goal. Non-goal is I want to encourage, I want to help, 100,000 people to also achieve their weight loss goals. I don't know, I've just made that up right now, but it's having a clear demarcation in terms of what your startup is actually trying to solve for, and the three things that you're just not going to focus on at this point in time until you solve for your three things. I did not do that when I was starting the Han Kimchi, and those are some of the lessons I considered to myself that I would do in for my next rodeo.
Great. So just two more questions to go. We got one from McKeith. It says, hi, Juri. I noticed you have an incredible stack of books. What are the books that you gift the most, or books you wished you read before you graduated? Cheers.
I see someone is a Tim Ferriss podcaster. So what are the books that I gift the most? I would say this. One is Mindset by Carol Dweck. This really changed. It really changed my life. I heard of this idea in my first people management training at Google. And prior to this book, I genuinely believed that, and again, I didn't really share my background, but I went to James Bruce. I went to a really highly selective, highly academic, very Asian high school. And what was taught and what was really encouraged was this idea that people were either smart or they weren't. You were a particular level of smart at year 6 and it would rank you into various schools, and that was it. This book really, through its it's very easy to read, through all of its research, through its sort of essay-like explanation of it all, it really shows you in different ways that people can change. And this growth mindset, I won't go into too much of it considering we only have a couple of minutes, but effectively, this book really did change my life. It really challenged me to think that there was no fixed way of intelligence that people had. I could change my level of intelligence in many different ways if I just put the time and effort into it, and that could be replicable for others. So Mindset by Carol Dweck is one. I've forgotten. Ooh, I guess if I'm not gifting it, if I've forgotten it, then there's a parable of OKRs. That was the one that I used to share, but I've just lost the name. So I might send it over to David and Audrey to send through. But
yeah, we'll drop in the notes. That's fine.
Mindset.
Perfect. Awesome. Last question from Tal. It says, hi, Juri. In aim of maximizing growth, both personal and career-wise, would it be better to start in corporate and move to a startup after developing some skills, or jump straight into a startup and learn with less structure?
I think this is the mother of all questions to end, and we've got 3 minutes to respond to it. The reality is, like I said, you just don't know until you've done it. You don't know till you've done it. And once you've done it, you're biased. And so, you'll make it work and you'll create your own story based on what it is that you did. Maybe, I know, because I used to be where you are, you ask these questions to try and gauge what you should do. You're effectively asking, what should I do? Like, what's the next step that I should take? And there is no right answer that I can give you. You have to figure it out for yourself. And this is why I, try to share the prompts, right? The prompt about, what was it? Those 5 things, like really, really reflect, really, really, introspect, like these 5 variables. You don't have to tell other people, but in your heart of hearts, how do you rank these 5 things? Creativity, colleagues, money, status, social impact. Rather than thinking about it as a startup or a corporate, like I said, give yourself options, like get the interviews done, like get the contracts in hand, and really evaluate the startups against these 5 variables and how they relate to you. The reality is, if you are seeking money, first and foremost, which you don't need to share with me, you don't need to, DM me later and be like, yes, I am one of those people. But genuinely, if that is how you personally, in your heart of hearts, rank these 5 things, don't go to a startup. You go to a bigger organization, an IB, straight out of uni, you will make a shit ton more money than a startup will in the first couple of years. I say that with the disclaimer that if you get into the right startup and it really skyrockets, that could change. But again, that's, I guess, where the risk portfolio comes into play, right? All of these things, these 5 variables, will relate to potential job opportunities in different ways. If you are, in your heart of hearts, really trying to do something for social impact, and you find a startup that's doing the exact same thing that you want to do, even if the social status is a little bit less than you desire, it's likely that you'll go for it. And so my response back to you would be, try and gain a more attuned level of self-awareness about what is important to you at this point in your life. And don't guilt yourself if, the response comes out a little different than you expect. Do it, learn. If in that environment you're not learning as fast as you could be, then I would really encourage you to make a change, because the biggest opportunity cost that you have, especially in your first decade after your graduation, is that you are free. It's unlikely that you are parents. It's unlikely that you have really big financial commitments, unless you all have mortgages. I don't know what the state of like UNSW students or anything else is these days. But the less you have tied down, the more opportunity that you can pursue in a real sense. You can go and live in the Valley for a couple of years. You can go to the UK for a couple of years. You can be really adaptable in terms of how much you earn. But a lot of those opportunities really radically diminish or change once you have kids. And so whilst you have the opportunity, double down on your learning. If you're in a place and you're not learning as much as you could be at a different place, like that is how I would sort of change, where you should go, what you should do. And if the startup is the right place for you to thrive in order to be learning at the pace that you should be, go for that. But it's not a blanket rule. I know a lot of startups that if you're in the wrong team, you're not going to be learning as quickly as you could be compared to a particular startup business unit in a corporate.
Beautiful. I think that's a wrap. Just like to say thank you guys all so much for tuning in and staying to the end. And of course, special thanks to Juri for coming on tonight and sharing some incredible lessons about your life, but also about the startup space. For this session, we'll be uploading it to our Facebook page within a few hours. And of course, we'll be leaving some show notes and some things that Juri mentioned as well on our Facebook. And yeah, that's all for tonight. Thank you guys all for coming. And of course, thank you, Juri.
All good. Thanks for having me both. Thanks for having me, everybody. And thanks for staying. Good luck all. You'll smash it. Bye, guys.